April 1927. Colonel Jim Porter lifts the glass, tastes what he's spent 3 years creating, and sets it down disappointed. He'd been trying to recreate Bass Ale. This wasn't it. The color was wrong, darker, more amber than he'd wanted. The taste wasn't quite right either. 3 years of work with chemist Archie Jones, countless variations of malt and hops, and he'd failed. The beer went into production anyway. Within 24 hours, Newcastle's police cells were full. The accidental beer. Porter hadn't set out to invent anything. He wanted to copy something that already worked, something people already loved. Bass Ale had dominated Burton-upon-Trent for generations. His own family had run breweries there, and he understood its appeal: strong enough to matter, smooth enough to drink, prestigious enough to charge for. The process consumed 3 years at Newcastle Brewery's Tyne Brewery site, where brewing had happened since 1868. Porter and Jones tested malts, adjusted temperatures, measured gravity, recorded failures. They were methodical, scientific, patient. The original gravity hit 1060 degrees. The alcohol by volume reached 6.25%. They priced it at 9 shillings per dozen pint bottles. Premium money for a beer positioned as working-class luxury. Porter tasted it and knew immediately, this wasn't Bass. The brewing chemistry had produced something entirely different. The blend of pale and caramel malts created a distinctive amber-brown hue. The reduced hop content softened the bitterness. The higher alcohol content gave it weight without heaviness. It was unique, which in Porter's mind meant it was wrong. Newcastle Breweries launched it anyway on April 25, 1927. The Newcastle Daily Journal carried the advertisement. Within a day, the Tyne and Wear police contacted the brewery with a request: reduce the strength. Their cells were full of men who'd discovered that the new brown ale, consumed at the pace they drank their usual lighter beers, hit considerably harder than expected. Porter's failure became an overnight sensation. The beer he'd tried to copy became the beer he accidentally invented. The following year, 1928, Newcastle Brown Ale swept gold medals at the International Brewers Exhibition. Porter's disappointment turned out to be everyone else's discovery. The working-class hero. Walk into any pub near the Tyne shipyards between 1930 and 1970. Evening shift just ended. Men still wearing work clothes, hands washed but not quite clean, settle onto bar stools and ask for brown. Not a beer or a pint, just brown. The clear glass bottles lined pub shelves across Newcastle, Gateshead, Sunderland. Dockers drank it after unloading cargo. Miners drank it after shifts underground. Steelworkers drank it still wearing the day's grime. The beer became synonymous with heavy industry, the economic backbone of the Northeast, not through marketing but through ritual. Payday meant brown. Saturday meant brown. Survival of another week in brutal work meant brown. The premium price never deterred them. 9 shillings per dozen was more than other ales, but working men saw it differently. This was their beer, made in their city, strong enough to acknowledge the work they'd done. The alcohol content gradually dropped from the original 6.25% as taxation and wartime ingredient shortages forced reformulation, but the identity remained fixed. Newcastle Brown Ale meant you'd worked for your drink. It meant you'd earned it. The bottle in your hand wasn't just beer, it was proof you'd survived another week. The Star and the Bridge. The Blue Star appeared on bottles in 1928, 1 year after launch. 5 points representing 5 breweries: John Barris and Company, Carr Brothers and Carr, J.J. Allison, W.H. Allison, and Swinburne and Company. They'd merged in 1890 to form Newcastle Breweries Limited. 57 years later, their star became an icon. The Tyne Bridge opened in 1928 as well. Soon it appeared on labels alongside the star. 2 symbols of Newcastle's identity, one architectural, one alcoholic. The clear glass bottle became instantly recognizable. The star meant local. The bridge meant home. Together they said, this beer belongs to this place. Geography wasn't marketing, it was the product. Going national. Local dominance was one thing. National distribution required different infrastructure entirely. The 1960 merger between Newcastle breweries and Scottish brewers created Scottish and Newcastle, a company large enough to move beyond regional markets. Newcastle Brown Ale became a flagship brand alongside McEwan's Export and Younger's Tartan Special. The distribution network expanded south, reaching pubs that had never stocked northern ales, appearing in off-licenses where customers had never heard a Geordie accent. UK sales peaked in the early 1970s. The beer that had lived in working-class pubs across Tyneside now appeared in suburban homes from Cornwall to Kent. Scottish and Newcastle's sales figures showed Newcastle Brown Ale everywhere, not just in industrial cities, but in market towns, university cities, seaside resorts. By 1997, the company claimed it was the most widely distributed alcoholic product in both pubs and off-licenses across the country. The expansion changed nothing about the liquid. Same recipe, same clear bottle, same blue star, but the meaning shifted subtly. What had been a regional identity marker became a national brand. Geordie still claimed it as theirs, and it was. But now people who'd never been to Newcastle drank it too. The beer was leaving home while still being made there. Student cult revival, late 1980s. Student unions across Britain started stocking Newcastle Brown Ale in serious quantities. University bars that had sold lager and bitter suddenly couldn't keep Brown in stock. Students who'd grown up in the South discovered it at Freshers' Week and kept drinking it through finals. The beer acquired cult status in university cities: Durham, Edinburgh, Manchester, Leeds. Middle-class kids drinking working-class beer, turning it into a symbol of something else. Not industrial labor, but rebellion against their parents' wine-drinking habits. The student embrace created a second peak in UK sales, a revival that had nothing to do with shipyards and everything to do with young people claiming authenticity they hadn't earned. Nobody at Newcastle breweries complained. Sales were sales. American conquest. The American story began quietly in the mid-1990s and accelerated into the early 2000s as something nobody at Scottish and Newcastle had quite predicted. Newcastle Brown Ale became a gateway drug for an entire generation of American beer drinkers. College students discovered it first. Too expensive to drink all night but affordable enough to start the evening, Brown offered something American beers didn't: flavor. Not overwhelming flavor. Craft IPAs would come later, but enough to suggest there was more to beer than Budweiser. The clear bottle looked distinctive on bar shelves. The blue star and imported status gave it cachet. The moderate 4.7% ABV meant you could drink several without disaster. Young Americans in Reno, Tennessee, North Carolina reported the same experience. Newcastle was the beer you drank before you knew you liked beer. It sat between mass-market lagers and craft brewing, occupying space that didn't quite exist in the American market. Imported but approachable, flavorful but not intimidating. Brewers, who later built careers in craft brewing, traced their origin stories back to Newcastle Friday traditions, to fake IDs used to buy six-packs, to that first moment of realizing beer could taste like something. By the early 2000s, the majority of Newcastle Brown Ale's sales came from the United States. Over 640,000 hectoliters sold annually in America by 2010. The beer ranked in the top 10 of American consumer polls, appearing alongside Guinness and Sierra Nevada. In Britain, it meant working-class heritage and heavy industry. In America, it meant you were the kind of person who drank imports, who'd moved beyond Coors Light, who'd discovered there was more. Same beer, different meaning. The Atlantic Ocean had transformed a Geordie working man's ale into a trendy American import. Leaving home. Success didn't save the Tyne brewery. Corporate logic killed it. Scottish and Newcastle invested £16.6 million in a new bottling plant at the Tyne site in 1999. 5 years later, on April 22, 2004, they announced closure. The consolidation made financial sense. Move production to the Federation Brewery site in Dunstan, Gateshead, purchased for £7.2 million, creating Newcastle Federation breweries with better efficiency and lower costs. May 2005. The last production run of Newcastle Brown Ale came off the Tyne brewery line. Workers who'd spent careers there bottled the final batch, labels marked with the date, 3,000 bottles distributed to employees as keepsakes. Pre-production trials at Dunston aimed to ensure taste wouldn't change. The beer would travel 4 miles across the River Tyne, still Newcastle, still Geordie, still home, except it wasn't. The brewery site where Newcastle Brown Ale had been born in 1927 was sold to a consortium: Newcastle University, Newcastle City Council, and Regional Development Agency, One North East. The Newcastle Science City project required space. Demolition began March 8, 2007. Sir Bobby Robson ceremonially triggered the controlled demolition of the Barrack Road bottling plant opposite St James's Park on June 22, 2007-2008. Corporate juggling. Heineken and Carlsberg bought Scottish and Newcastle in a joint deal in 2008, carving up the company's brands between them. Heineken took Newcastle Brown Ale. 3 years later, the beer moved again. The Dunston Brewery closed in 2010. Scottish and Newcastle cited falling beer market demand, overcapacity across their plants, and Dunston operating at just 60% capacity. The fact that Newcastle Brown Ale sales had never been higher, driven by American demand, didn't matter. Production moved entirely to John Smith's brewery in Tadcaster, North Yorkshire. The beer called Newcastle was now brewed 95 miles south of Newcastle. Tadcaster supplied UK and European markets until 2017, when Heineken began production at their Zoeterwoude brewery in the Netherlands to speed delivery to export markets, including the United States. The recipe changed subtly. Caramel colouring removed in 2015, replaced by roasted malts to achieve the dark hue. In 2000, the word ale had been dropped from UK labels to attract younger drinkers, then quietly reinstated in 2004 when nobody noticed the change. Each move, each reformulation, each efficiency measure made sense in boardrooms. The beer was still called Newcastle Brown Ale. It still carried the blue star. But what did Newcastle mean when Newcastle didn't make it? The American experiment. Heineken gave American production to Lagunitas Brewing Company, their California subsidiary. Chicago and Petaluma facilities would brew Newcastle Brown Ale for the US market using a different recipe: American Centennial and Chinook hops, Lagunitas English House Ale yeast. Brewmaster Jeremy Marshall admitted he barely knew Newcastle beyond drinking it in Tennessee in the late 1990s, on a quest for more flavor. American sales had collapsed, down 19% in 2017, down 13% in 2018. The Lagunitas version aimed to recapture lost customers by making it more like American craft beer, bolder, hoppier, darker. It tasted nothing like the original. Old fans hated it. Coming home, Christmas Eve, 2024. A North Carolina beer drinker found 6-packs in a cooler bearing words that hadn't appeared on American bottles in 5 years, imported from England. The original UK recipe, brewed in Tadcaster, exported to America after Lagunitas Chicago brewery closed. The beer that had been reformulated, Americanized, and stripped of its identity had returned to what it was. Online forums erupted. "This is the real deal." Beer writers confirmed it. Heineken quietly acknowledged, yes, the original recipe was back in America. The experiment had failed. The gateway beer that introduced Americans to flavor in the 1990s and 2000s had spent 5 years as something else, something designed to compete with craft beer it had helped create, and Americans who remembered what it tasted like rejected it. Newcastle Brown Ale came home by leaving home. The beer created in Newcastle in 1927 no longer brews there, hasn't since 2005, but the liquid inside the bottle tastes like it did when it crossed the Atlantic decades ago. Geography became metaphor. The beer's identity survived corporate ownership, factory closures, recipe changes, and reformulation by never fully disappearing. It left Newcastle, it left Britain, it came back to itself. Colonel Porter's accidental beer endures, but Newcastle makes it somewhere else now.